The reality is that the problems in financial services or the problems in asset management are actually in some ways harder than the problems that you get in physics.
I really was excited to do something that could have a really big impact, where I could interact with the whole world and build something that everyone can use. You know, in this case, it was building portfolios for people.
What happens when rocket scientists start giving up physics for finance? You get really smart people bringing brand new perspectives to one of the most complex systems on Earth. Just like discovering new elements which make up the building blocks of the physical world, these minds are creating new strategies that make up the building blocks of the next generation of portfolios. But unlike the physical world where the rules are static, the financial system is in a constant state of flux. And that means the potential to innovate with new strategies is ever present.
So, Dave, this is exciting. I get to sit down in the Real Vision Studios in New York, and I'm here with Dave Berns, who is the CIO of Simplify. Dave, you and I work together at Simplify, and I got to be honest with you, it's the very first time I've actually had the chance to work with what I would think of as a true rocket scientist. Before we go into what we're doing at Simplify and all of that, and I know you hate doing this, I know it makes you stressed out to think about talking about yourself, but you're actually coming into the financial world in a path that's not dissimilar from a lot of people with an academic background, but you were actually a quantum computing Ph.D. at MIT. How the hell did you get into that, and what made you transition over to the financial world, or more accurately, asset management?
Literally the only thing I found interesting my entire life was physics.
Okay.
I couldn't find anything else I was interested in college and grad school, and I just went with it. But then, you know, when you start doing research in physics and discovering things, there's only like 10 people in the world that know what you're doing, that can like read your papers and stuff. And I found it isolating. And I really was excited to do something that could have a really big impact, where I could interact with the whole world and build something that everyone can use. You know, in this case, it was building portfolios for people.
Well, there's no chance in hell I could do the math associated with a quantum computing degree. The reality is that the problems in financial services or the problems in asset management are actually in some ways harder than the problems that you get in physics. And Emmanuel's classic line is, God eventually accedes when you find the truth in physics and doesn't change his mind. But that's not how markets work. In markets, we often talk about them as complex dynamic systems. And you and I have talked a fair amount about the work of Ole Peters and others, this idea of ergodic versus non-ergodic systems, how they're influenced and how ensemble averages are not the same as time averages. But it all comes together in kind of this broader picture of there is no solution. There's a solution for now, there's a solution for how the state exists, and then you need to modify it going forward.
Financial regulation can change in an instant, and we've just seen this recently with derivatives, for example, right? So how dynamic it is, it could be instantaneous, it could be a 30, 40 year period before we see real evolution. And then on top of it, the main source of input into this from the outside into the system that makes it open is human behavior.
Can you just very quickly explain what the derivative rule change was and what that created, how that changed ETFs? Because that's ultimately what brought me over to the ETF space, is the realization that stuff could be done that couldn't be done before.
Ultimately, what matters is it just opened up the landscape of what could be done with derivatives. In general, we have way more room to take standard return distributions, equity return distribution, for instance, and just start performing plastic surgery on it with derivatives. Taking these nonlinear instruments and modifying return distributions that start to, open up a whole new periodic table around physics, periodic table of elements of these portfolio building blocks.
Well, and so again, this brings us back to the Emanuel Derman type dynamic, right? Where he is famous for his observation that ultimately the vanilla is going to be the most difficult to price, right? It's the most difficult instrument to understand. And the derivatives are actually remarkably easy, right? Because a call or a put or even a complex, swaption, payer contract, et cetera, is tied to the behavior of the underlying, the price behavior of the underlying, or the rate of that change, the implied volatility, or the perception around that. It's actually really easy to solve that problem, but the underlying is really, really hard, right? How do you value the stock?
That's a deeply interesting problem. It gets to something that no one really focuses on, but given how dynamic and how much human interaction there is to the ecosystem, it's very hard not to expect that underlier, the return distribution of the underlier, is going to change. So at Simplify, we're building these really intriguing new types of return distributions and payoff functions. But then there's a whole nother layer underneath it of, okay, but how is the return distribution changing itself in time underneath that we're building this overlay on top of? And what's the pricing of the derivatives? How are they being mispriced? And how is it changing in time? It's a whole nother layer.
This idea of the derivative being very easy, right? If you and I put calls and puts into a portfolio, we can very quickly understand how that portfolio is going to behave based on the underlying, right? I add a call to the S&P 500, is going to exhibit increased convexity to the top side for the most part. There's modifications around that tied to how implied volatility behaves. Likewise, if you put a put into a portfolio and the S&P falls, it's going to fall less than the S&P itself would. When you start thinking about this underlying distribution, what you're actually talking about are the changes in how you would expect the day-to-day returns or the cumulative returns for the S&P itself to behave. So it's very different than talking about the derivatives. And so ironically, the derivative rule allows us to introduce derivative strategies into ETFs that previously would have required one-off processes and intense negotiations with the SEC, not dissimilar to what people are seeing as they try to introduce things like Bitcoin ETFs, et cetera. Suddenly that can actually be done in a very formulaic way where the rules have been laid out and we can construct portfolios around that. But it also creates this weird explosion because some of my research has shown, and some of the work that you and I have collaborated on recently, you begin to see, wait a second, is the behavior of the market participants, this interaction, how the individuals behave, how the machines and the algorithms behave, is that actually changing the underlying distribution function of the market? And can you use those derivatives to increase overall performance, make it quote unquote better, which is always a dangerous phrase. But
this is basically like a beta, I'm going to use this loosely, like a beta versus an alpha discussion. And I think us at Simplify, we really want to provide better solutions in both spaces. And you're right, if the distributions are really changing and you can stay on top of it, now you can really start to access alpha, alpha, using it loosely again, with the derivatives, as opposed to just modifying a distribution, creating another type of beta. It comes up all the time at Simplify. Our investors ask this question a lot. What is the real point of the structure that we're providing? Is it beta? Is it alpha? And it's really cool to be sitting right in between both of those and taking on hedge funds and other shops who've been providing beta or alpha for a long time, and now we can do it in the ETF space.
And so you introduced this idea of different types of beta, and you and I have had discussions around like the DNA at Simplify, and that obviously, you and Paul founded the firm initially with the concept of, hey, we have the access to these derivatives now, we can change the shape of the outputs that occur given the underlying performance. So let's just stick with the S&P to make life simple. If the S&P goes up, we can create a product that goes up more than the S&P in an up market, but doesn't go down linearly or twice the exposure to the upside. It doesn't necessarily have twice the exposure to the downside. That creates portfolios that can be held differently than many of the levered products that are out there. They behave differently. They fulfill different roles in portfolios. You wrote a book. The title is longer than the book, actually, which is actually one of the things that I love, because I always joke that business books should only be 15 pages in length. But your book was really tight and really well done. I encourage people to actually look at it. It's actually a really cool book. Where you introduce this idea of moments or higher moments in return distributions, which can really only be captured by things like derivatives. But maybe you can explain for just a second what it means when we talk about the higher moments.
So one aspect is the return distribution that goes into your capital market forecasting and your optimizer. And so higher moments is just saying, is there a third moment, fourth moment skew, kurtosis on the distribution that we should be thinking about and being careful of, and are those things changing in time? But the other really important part of higher moments in a portfolio, none of it matters if you don't know the utility function for the client. For a long time, we used this sort of symmetric utility function. Mean variant optimization is just a play off of that. But we've learned in behavioral finance that people have very asymmetric and sometimes very strange preferences. And the only way to really account for that in a portfolio is with higher moments. It's just a fact. So if you combine that need to properly address client needs with higher moments, with the fact that return distributions do have higher moments, they're evolving aggressively, bring those two together, And it's really critical to be managing that.
So let me give a real world example of that. If I take a 25-year-old, the traditional approach within a target date fund, for example, would be to say you're going to have 95% equity exposure and 5% fixed income exposure. And really what you're trying to do is recognize that they have almost no accumulated capital to protect, right? And a ton of human capital that is then flowing in over their lifetime as increased savings that in and itself modifies that return distribution and makes it possible for you to have more equity exposure. One of the things you might point out is that the right solution for that investor is not necessarily to have 95% equity exposure, but to have a levered equity exposure by owning call options, for example. We're doing a lot of work on this idea of using the non-recourse leverage associated with in-the-money call options and how that can create a product that's really appropriate for a young person who could theoretically sustain a much bigger loss of their capital, but could also be really advantaged by capturing that asymmetric distribution.
I promised myself I wasn't going to say this during this, but it's complicated. You know, it really depends on the utility function, and then bring in, you know, all this capital, their balance sheet, you know, what in the book we call SLR, standard of living risk. And you have to bring these two things together, and the output is, it just depends.
And it depends on other things as you introduce the book, or you know, how stable is the income, right? So, you know, a lot of people in our industry tend to be underinvested in securities because all of their income is already associated with the market. They tend to be too conservative relative to what they could otherwise have, and it could end up spectacularly well, it could end up spectacularly poorly. We hit on this idea of the different types of beta and the morphing into alpha. And, you know, from a personal standpoint, when I joined, you know, part of the dynamic was recognizing the opportunity to add value by influencing the shape of the distributions, or how we chose to express that in portfolios, and introducing them in interesting and novel ways. But you also hit on this idea of the changing regulations associated with the derivative rule, and you said, you know, those can take a long time to change. And this is one of these spectacular scenarios where, like, the regulations that actually were changed were last updated in 1979. Right? So I mean, we're talking about a 41-year-old regulation that changed. Like that, I've been doing this for 30 years. It never occurred to me that I was going to be able to step over into the ETF space and do some of the stuff that I've done within hedge funds. And yet, you know, you and Paul saw this developing. You stepped in. You saw this opportunity to create the, you know, alternative forms of beta. And now part of what I would argue that we're recognizing is that that's turning into sources of alpha. We're recognizing sources of alpha. We talked about the distribution dynamic. The one that's my personal favorite is the tax dynamics, right? As you begin to think about the impact of tax in a derivative and in an ETF structure.
Paul and I sort of stepped back and said, all right, zeroth order, we'd like to provide orthogonal, as much as we could, orthogonal types of distributions to the masses. That felt like a more important thing to do than to provide alternative alpha sources. The magnitude of the alpha really depends on how much the distributions are changing and how much of that alpha we can access by using derivatives to play off the mispricing that is happening from the distributions changing. We started with the more orthogonal type betas. It'll be really exciting to see how it all evolves and how much we focus on the more alpha type stuff, but it's both are incredibly exciting paths, and I think there's a good chance that we end up really merging those in many of our products.
Never been so excited about an opportunity as I am in this situation. When we talk about this idea of orthogonality, so orthogonality means that, you know, something is not moving in the same direction. It's actually moving directly across,
distinct,
right?
In
a distinct fashion, right? So when you introduced this idea of orthogonal betas or different type of betas, what was the thought process there? Like, what are you looking to accomplish there?
Ultimately, we're trying to solve the problems of asset allocators, advisors, institutions. So every time we introduce a new periodic table element for the portfolio, we start by saying, what can we help asset allocators with? What problem can we solve? What can we package in ETF that directly solves that? So for instance, our downside convexity equity stuff, that's really to give people a different way to mitigate downside without relying on other solutions, whether it's bonds or, you know, some kind of general volatility control. We want to give people another route.
one of the things that regular Real Vision viewers know is that I'm always talking about, you want to find the non-economic player. You want to find the player who's being forced to do something, not because they want to, but because a regulatory framework requires them to. And so part of what we're trying to take advantage of increasingly, and this is the source of this type of alpha, is where there are these regulatory dynamics, right? So tax would be a great one, right? When you're thinking about a taxable account, they have to behave very differently come April 15th, or come November 30th in the form of a mutual fund, or come December 31st in the form of an individual who's trying to make a tax year, right? They have very different mandates than a perpetual institution, right? And so a crazy amount has been written about the endowment model type stuff of David Swensen, where we're thinking about these infinitely lived assets, you know, and Yale University is going to be around for 1,000 years sort of thing, right? But when we start to talk about the rest of the market, like there's just, it almost is surprising to me how little work has been done on what causes people to have to do stuff because of changing regulations. Biden administration raising tax rates, how that's going to impact things, et cetera. I mean, it's just an astonishing area to me that feels so underexplored, because so much of the industry has been built around the idea, particularly today, you know, of every 25-year-old is exactly the same, every 35-year-old is exactly the same. Let's put them into a target date fund. Let's, you know, plow them forward, et cetera. And as you point out, it's complicated, right?
Yeah,
It's just not easy.
I mean, but part of why that happened is because the periodic table of portfolio building blocks was limited.
Yep.
You have an equity distribution, you have a duration risk distribution, you know, you have a couple of sort of these core types of holdings that you can marginally modify with smart beta, et cetera. But you couldn't really do much to greatly orthogonalize it and build really novel things. But with the new derivatives rules, you can do that. And so it opens this whole array of more personalized portfolio construction. And on top of it, like you said, the tax advantages that you can get with derivatives, and then compound that out tax-free in the ETF structure is amazing.
Thinking about this periodic table of elements, right? You know, and so when you think about that, and you're like, okay, there's a credit factor, and there's an equity factor, and there's a value factor. Like, we're used to thinking about these terms in that context, but I would argue that like the vast majority of people never stop and think, you know, okay, you know, equities return 8% and bonds return their coupon, right? And we see this in the discussion around pensions, right? Where, you know, the equity allocation is creeping up for many state pension plans, for example, because there's no way they can point to bonds yielding 2% or 1% and say, you know, oh, we expect to get 4% out of them, right? And so they're forced to increase their equity allocation almost under a hope framework than anything else. When you talk about expanding that universe of elements on the periodic table, how could that change?
People invest in bonds greatly just to minimize the volatility at the portfolio level. But why do they really do that? They're fundamentally doing that to remove left tail or left side of the distribution events. But if we can provide a way to stay focused on equities and not require people to move into bonds just to scale the volatility, if we can just take out the event they don't want, that's a great example, I think.
Well, and it frees you up to use either a larger fraction of the portfolio to gain access to equities, which may or may not offer excess return, you know, relative to bonds, but certainly have the prospect of doing it. And then going back to this idea of changing distributions, I mean, one of the things that's characterized the last really 22 years has been the rise of risk parity, and this idea that a bond portfolio not only reduced volatility, which is, you know, really, as you point out, kind of the historical return function of that 40 in the portfolio, right? It's a fixed income piece that continually pays relatively high dividends. They're not dividends, obviously, but, you know, as a cash income component to it that you can continually reinvest. And then it also just has much lower volatility, right? I mean, the volatility on a 3-month bond is 0. The volatility on a 10-year bond, I want to say, is about 4.5 to 5, right? Versus equities at 16, and in times of stress, much higher than that. But in the past 22 years, this idea of risk parity, this idea that you could combine the portfolios and bonds would function as protection, right? Not only not go down as much when markets sold off, but would actually go up and provide you with additional firepower. That's cushioned portfolios to an extraordinary degree. And the problem now is that it's really debatable how much of that is left, right, with bonds where they are, particularly at the front end.
I agree. I think it's making everyone sharpen their pencils around what is the point of the bonds in my portfolio and what are the alternatives. And I think our equity with downside convexity solution is one definitely compelling idea.
So we talk about this dynamic of the interaction between bonds and equities and how that shifted roughly 22 years ago, 1998. The very distinct shift in the relationship between bonds and equities as the Fed moved from targeting inflation to targeting asset price depreciation and the loss of the wealth effect and financial crises, et cetera. That dynamic, that correlation shift radically changed how you used bonds in portfolios, how portfolios themselves were constructed. But it's almost kind of a no-no in asset allocation. That's a very technical term targeted at young children, but no-no, right? In the dynamic of relying on correlations to protect a portfolio. I mean, that's not a good thing in general.
The prominence of mean variance optimization, modern portfolio theory, brought correlation to the forefront, and it's been the primary tool for people and to diversify portfolios and think about risk. And it's a key component, and I generally think it's a very valuable thing, but I don't think it's the entire story.
And the instability of those correlations has preceded every crisis we've had.
100%. So I mean, if you want to do asset allocation right, you have to be constantly reassessing your forecast, and frankly, most people don't. Right? Most people don't have a forecast that they can rigorously back up for volatility, returns, volatility, covariance, et cetera. And that's a big reason people move to things like heuristics, 60-40, just as a heuristic, or risk parity is a heuristic. I mean, fundamentally with risk parity, you're not optimizing utility function, right? I mean, you're not forecasting return or any moment besides volatility, and I get it. Volatility forecasting is relatively straightforward, has the lowest error bars of any moment for sure, but it's still completely missing a ton of the pieces of the puzzle there. So that's why in my book I focus purely on the full utility optimization with all moments.
And this idea of using heuristics, right? I mean, it almost goes to the Nassim Taleb type framework, right? Why do we use a 60-40 portfolio as compared to a 62-38 portfolio, right? It's because the simple reality is it doesn't really matter that much, right? There is no right answer. We're basically going for something that, satisfies some underlying condition, right? Chris Cole with his Dragon portfolio that you and I have spent a lot of time on, at the end of the day, he could have, optimized to some absolute solution, but the reality is that it's basically 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, right? I mean, he's splitting up the individual components in a way that is far from optimized. It's actually set up basically as a heuristic, which is just another way of saying it's reasonably robust, right? I mean, it's going to hold up across time.
I really sympathize with that, and so much so that a big part of my book is about the error bars on asset allocation. And I've never personally seen any writing, any textbooks on asset allocation that had error bars. I take this very seriously about, what can we really achieve doing asset allocation? What's a real tangible difference? Is 60-40 different than 62-38? I think the practical difference is that you really can get incredibly substantially different results by modifying your forecast and using different utility functions. For instance, if you use a utility function completely with no loss aversion in it, versus one where you have a very strong loss aversion, we're talking about portfolios that are 70% allocated to equities versus 15%.
Yeah.
That beats your error bars.
Yeah.
So for me, I think about it more, I support the idea of binning people by general behavioral preferences, but I think there's plenty of enough distinction if you really start to think about utility functions more accurately.
We've seen the triumph of this idea that, empirical finance, which, Schiller et al. Won the Nobel Prize in, I believe it was 2013. We look back over history and we say, this defines the asset class, right? Equities return 8.25% per year. Error bars, to your point, right? When you have 16 vol asset on top of an 8.25 return, you're basically saying, I have no idea. In any given year, I have no idea what the return stream is going to look like. And so you have to start thinking about these very, very long windows. In particular, I would highlight that the RIAs are in a really difficult, the registered investment advisors are in a really difficult position right now, because they're kind of going through what I would suggest that a lot of the asset management space, the fund managers, went through over the past several years. Like, how do they add value? How do they actually step in and help a client manage a portfolio where if the market goes down, they're going to get blamed. And if the market rips away to the top side, they're going to get blamed for trying to be conservative and not keeping up with the market. The whole point of what Simplify is doing is actually targeting the assistance to that group, working both with robo-advisors and with the RIAs, right? We're not distinguishing, but...
Yeah, I think the key thing for all advisors is to have conviction in their process. And I think that the products we're building at Simplify, the tools we're providing on our website, the support that our sales and research teams provides to clients and prospects, we're trying to empower them to have conviction in a system that they can really stand behind. And I think advisors, when they have the conviction, they can really explain their process to their clients. In my experience, those advisors keep their clients are happy, and they're successful.
I'm going to redirect for a second, because we talked about the dynamic of your background in computing and quantum computing in particular, but you are also the kid of Staten Island cops. How'd you end up at MIT?
My parents in high school said I was going to college, and I said no. And then my mom filled out an application to college for me. And my dad said, it was 96. He said, you're going to go do something in tech. You're going to do electrical engineering and computer science, because it was 96. Yeah. So I started first semester doing electrical engineering, and I was forced to take a physics course. And that's how the love affair began. The whole world sort of became clear to me, and all I wanted to do was understand why everything was the way it was. If you knocked on something, did it make a sound or not? Why is something a certain color? I was just obsessed with understanding the world from the most base level.
One of the things I love about what I'm doing now, particularly moving over to the ETF space, is that suddenly I'm actually able to help the portfolios of the cop, right? Help the portfolios of the average person in a totally different way than I've been doing for a very long time.
I'm obsessed with democratizing things for the masses. Give everyone the same opportunities that the rich have gotten through structured products and hedge funds that they literally only the uber wealthy are allowed to participate in legally. That was exactly the kind of reach I wanted to have when I left grad school, because it just felt, when I left physics, because it just felt so isolated, and I wanted to just help people and do something for the masses. So this is fitting that bill for sure. It's so exciting.
You're not active on Twitter. I'm too active on Twitter, but people reach out to me on a regular basis and are always surprised when I respond. But that is part of the fun of doing this, right? It's not just about, like, I don't care how much somebody has in their account or how important they are in that context. It's solving those problems and actually thinking about it from a utility function and addressing the needs of the school teacher or the needs of the individual, who's just unsure about where it's going and what they should be doing. To me, that actually is the most interesting part of the challenge, right? Because it's almost going back to your point about physics. That's going to be the interesting question, right? Because it's a different answer at every different period in time.
I love it. I'm with you.
And again, to go back to your point about it's complicated in the higher moments in the portfolio, the example I was giving of a young person grabbing greater convexity to the top side, somebody who's older, who's looking to protect their portfolio, who's much less worried about the lottery ticket ride to a dramatically higher wealth distribution, and instead is trying to say, I'm just trying to keep in the game. Like, that's a product that makes a ton of sense suddenly, right? Because you're actually introducing a portfolio that cuts off a lot of that left tail.
Yep. It's complicated, but
it's complicated.
It depends.
That's right.
They're personalized.
When we think about this periodic table analogy, where else do you see areas of exploration?
I think inflation is one that is really important.
We could decide that we wanted to protect a portfolio against inflation by just going out and buying a ton of gold or a ton of oil futures or various other components, right? Yes, there's product-specific risk, and that can be solved through diversification. But when you start again talking about those higher moments, the ability to modify that portfolio to hedge your exposure, what really becomes important is expressing it in a non-linear fashion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the worst case scenario for somebody who decides inflation is coming and reorients their portfolio in that way is not actually that inflation comes, it's that inflation doesn't come, right? And those hedges that they had quote unquote put on, if they're done in a linear fashion, cause their portfolio to spectacularly underperform to the downside,
Exactly.
right? For me, the language simplify, the name simplify, right? It's easy to get into the play on words and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is most of the things that we start talking about when you start talking about hedging a portfolio, they really aren't available to your typical RIA or even to your typical individual who's trying to manage their portfolio, right? In just a realistic sense, imagine you've got a 60-40 traditional portfolio and you have 80% of your allocation to the S&P within your 60, right? Which is aggressive, but fine, will make my life simple, right? 0.6 times 0.8 is half your portfolio. And then if you have a hedging budget of 2%, right, you're literally talking about, and you're rolling over the course of the year, like you're gonna spend 70 to 80% of your time on 1%, less than 1% of your portfolio at any point in time trying to figure out what's the right strike, what's the right tenor, where do I roll this, et cetera, right? It's just not feasible.
There's a lot of operational challenges, and for some people it's not even a tenable thing to do. But managing a derivative strategy is complicated. It's hard, and you really want experts to be doing it for you. They're just, by definition, nonlinear instruments are going to be incredibly sensitive to what you do. Whether you close a position today, tomorrow, the next day. I mean, those little decisions on a daily basis can be monumental because it's so nonlinear. Yeah. So for me, it's the strategy aspect that's the hardest.
The advantage of doing it inside the ETF structure is twofold, as you point out. One, you're putting it in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing and does it on a regular basis and is being paid for it, and surprisingly affordable from my perspective, I think. But the second component that you're really tapping into there is that you're capturing some tax efficiency by doing it within the ETF structure.
Certainly.
And the last component is that you're simplifying, right? It's a line item on your portfolio. You have your S&P exposure, or you have your interest rate exposure, et cetera, as compared to trying to do two things at the same time and manage all these exposures. Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, I mean, I am incredibly excited. We are on such an adventure here. And I am thrilled to be able to introduce you to everybody and look forward to the innovations that we develop on the periodic table and how we start to pull those together into additional portfolios.
It's so good to have you, bud.
Thank you very much, man.
Simplify isn't just repackaging tired old hedge fund strategies and dumping them into ETFs. They're bringing innovative and, most importantly, distinct strategies that offer completely different return distributions to anything else on the market. And this is changing the game for advisors and their clients, as they can utilize these products to personalize not only what they're invested in, but how they are invested and the risks they are exposed to.